Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and I'm calling this set of shows this week Moments in History, which means we're encompassing quite a few different subjects. It doesn't fall under one direct banner, but actually some of the shows this week are going to be about the Third Reich, the German side of things. We've got a fantastic show on the MG42 coming up your way tomorrow with Nick Bubb, but today we are talking about another aspect of the Third Reich. My guest today calls himself an Axis biographical researcher and is bringing us the result of decades of work studying the second kind of tier of Nazi leadership. So Michael Miller, I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Michael. How are you today?
Great, very great. Thank you, Paul. Good to be here.
So we talk a lot about Hitler and those very, very obviously well-known people who at the very top of the Third Reich. And we also talk a lot about those sort of sadistic, thuggish kind of concentration camp guards that are doing things like that. But what we don't talk about enough are that kind of second and third tier of the people behind the scenes making the organization run. So my first question before we bring up your PowerPoint is, why don't we talk about these people as much as we should?
I can't say exactly why, but I think in popular consciousness, most people are interested only in the big names, the ones who really made a historical impact to their way of thinking. Your Hitler, Goering, Himmler, Heydrich, Goebbels, obviously. And then also the ones who, out of some kind of lurid interest, people like to focus on those who are involved in the actual commission of atrocities.
Yeah.
Your statists in the concentration camps, the usual names, Mengele, Irma Grese, maybe Rudolf Höss. People might be familiar with that name. But of course, lost in the middle, as you say, are people like those who I focus on, the second tier leaders, people below the level of a Hitler and Himmler and all that. I study the generals of the SS and the German police, of the SA, the NSKK, all of Germany's paramilitary organizations, and then the Gauleiter and the Deputy Gallighters, who were also known sometimes as Little Hitlers, which is actually quite accurate. They ruled according to they ran their Gaue as if they were the kings, their individual regions, and they had no time for really any other consideration except their own little fiefdom. So, I think that with the exception of Germany and some other countries in Europe, there hasn't been a lot of focus on people like these Gauleiter. No. There's been just a wealth of biographies have come out in recent years. People have focused on individual Gauleiter. My approach is kind of encyclopedic.
Yeah, kind of list them all, and we will bring up your PowerPoint in a minute. And I should remind folks that there are links to your books, and you have your Amazon.com author profile linked below. And and it's sometimes, as we'll find out, some of them have got obvious kind of, I hate kind of labeling people with this evil trait, but some of them are there's this manager kind of almost in the background anonymous quality to them that they made this evil mechanism work, but weren't necessarily, as you said earlier, they weren't going out there with killing people to death with a whip. They weren't doing that, but they're part of the organization that allowed that to go on. But anyway, we'll bring up your PowerPoint, and folks, what we'll do is we'll do kind of questions about the individuals as we go along, although I'm fairly certain Michael will be answering the kind of questions you have, and any sort of broader questions about how the Nazi party functioned, we'll kind of leave them for the end if there indeed is time at the end, because there's a lot of people to go through. But basically, I'm going to hand over to my guest, Michael, take us through some of these people and look at the variety of types of people that ended up in this role.
Thanks, Woody. I'll try not to get too verbose. I'm going to start with this first image. It's often we refer to these guys as monsters. A lot of people do, and they kind of characterize them based on very real facts, like that they were in fact mass criminals and war criminals. Yeah. But they dehumanize them, and there is a reason, though, that we have those views of these people. This was an incredibly, and I'm trying to be as fair as I can when I deal with the Gauleiter. Fair and objective. They were cruel, corrupt. They were greedy. They were inhuman in many ways toward other people, obviously. And so one of the worst of the bunch, in my opinion, is a guy who only served 6 years of imprisonment after World War II. He went on to a very successful career. I'll talk about him more a bit later, but that's Josef Grohe. And normally I'm kind of a purist when it comes to German place names. So just from the start, I'm going to say it's going to be difficult for me, but I'm going to use the anglicized versions of, in this case, he was the Gauleiter of Köln-Aachen. So I'm going to say Cologne-Aachen. And when we get to talking about München, I'll say Munich, Wien, Vienna. It's difficult for me. I'm not used to that, but it's easier to say them in the English way.
Yeah, and it'll be easier for us who are less involved in this, speaking of German on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, it's thank you for tolerating our lack of intelligence.
I know how arrogant it sounds, and I don't mean it that way. But moving on to the next slide. All right. So these are the first 3 volumes of the Gallighter Series, which I've researched and written in collaboration with Andreas Schultz. Andreas is an amazing biographical researcher based in Berlin, and I first made his acquaintance in 2002. He's helped me in the creation of, well, let's see, we're up to, it'll be 9 books by sometime early next year.
Wow.
So there will be a 4th volume. I can't say exactly when, probably a few years. The first one here came out in 2012, volume 2 in 17, and volume 3 with a new publisher, because my previous publisher, Roger Bender, passed away in 2020. But now I'm with Fonthill in the UK, and the 3rd volume came out in 2021. Volume 4 is going to cover all of the deputy Gallighters, as well as the illegal Austrian Gallighters from before the Anschluss of 1938. Wow. So moving to the next slide. I'm going to be talking today about what the Gauleiter were, but there's a lot of examples of people talking about what are not Gauleiters. They're still calling them Gauleiters. Basically, Gauleiter has become just a label to denote any brutal or heavy-handed leader. It's gotten a lot of currency in the past year and a half, obviously, because of the war in Ukraine. Just about every Russian overlord over provinces, around the Donetsk region or wherever, they're being referred to as Gauleiters. And just this morning, I saw a reference on Twitter to the British Home Secretary. It said the Nazi Gauleiter Suella Braverman. Oftentimes these labels apply quite well. Maybe it does in the case of Ms. Braverman. Not to get too political, but anyway, yeah, it certainly could fit. But again, kind of a purist. I like to let words mean what they mean. And for me, the only Gauleiter are the Nazi ones. So these are all references here to non-Gauleiter. Next up, the actual definition. It's a regional leader of the Nazi Party, as most people know. Hitler designated these people, handpicked them to serve at his pleasure. He was the only one who could dismiss them. They reported directly to him. That changed a little bit later on, and we'll get to that later. There became kind of a human filter between the Gauleiter and Hitler. But initially, and Katja Hoyer mentioned this in one of her presentations a while ago, it really made me think. Hitler, unlike the Nazis, unlike the communists and the social democrats, they created the Gau system so that they could divide Germany up according to, and they made their own party directly mirror, or almost directly, the electoral districts, or Wahlkreise, of the Weimar Republic, because they had to campaign throughout Germany, and each electoral district helped to elect people to the Reichsgau, the German parliament, and also eventually the president. So I'll try not to do too many ums. Hitler wisely decided to focus regionally rather than on the entire country, like the parties of the left had done and other right-wing parties. He designated one especially loyal individual to rule within each electoral district. And, these guys were mostly hired on the basis of their loyalty to him. And in the pre-1933 years, their role was entirely political. Of course, Hitler hadn't come to power yet, so they were not yet administrating anything except their own party machinery. And occasionally the party would be banned in certain regions. And it was banned before the creation of the Gallighter system. It was banned after the Munich Putsch of 1923. But kind of rambling there. So I'll say each one of the Gauleiter, each Gau, had within it a number of Ortsgruppen, or local groups. And later that changed. They created a larger grouping called the Kreise, which basically matched the county. Yep. And counties, or Kreise, thus consisted of Ortsgruppen. And there were, around the time Hitler came to power in 1933, there were about 35 Gaue that had increased to 43 by 1942. And it included one special Gau that had no geographical attachment. It was the Auslandsorganisation, or the foreign organization, which was responsible for the care and control of Germans throughout the world. Now, prior to 1933, or prior to the rise to power of Hitler, they, like I said, they held a strictly political purpose, and were tasked with administration. Moving to the next. Oh, and first I should also point out that is a Gauleiter who will not be covered in this presentation. I'm only covering those who were in business during the war, so 1939 to 45. This guy is Hans Schemm, who was also the Reich leader of teachers, and he was killed in an air crash in December of 34.
I'm guessing, Michael, it'd be an interesting rabbit hole to talk about how the method went of the Nazi Party in the 1930s, taking control of the regions within Germany where their support was less than in other regions. Because that's a fascinating story of, we talked about with Katia, in fact, that kind of manipulation of bringing the right people in there. But that process of gradual tentacles spreading out was fascinating, even if it's horrible. But it was quite a process.
One of the best examples of taking somebody and putting them into a territory that was not too friendly to the Nazi Party was when Hitler chose Goebbels to become Gauleiter of Berlin in 1926.
Right, yeah.
So, more on him later, of course.
Yeah, indeed.
All right, just briefly, I found this picture on Facebook the other day, and it just seems to sum up for me the vanity, the corruption, the lack of empathy that characterized Gauleiters like Erich Koch, who you see here. He was also Reich commissioner in the Ukraine. You can see he's got a few of his victims dangling in the background, but it just seemed like a particularly striking image by the Mexican caricaturist Miguel Covarrubias. Then a bit on Hitler's leadership style. Of course, I can only go very briefly, but it's been written about countless times. He had the absolute control over the Reich. Whether he was an able leader or not, he was the head of the snake. Very egotistical. Ian Kershaw has referred to his rule being largely charismatic. It was the spirit of his personality and his charisma that basically kept him where he was. And he wasn't a particularly good dictator. He knew how to choose loyal subordinates, and he wasn't particularly decisive. And by the end, he was, of course, drug-addled and felt like he was extremely paranoid, had his reasons for paranoia, especially after the bomb plot in July of 44. But he actually was able to admit, despite the ego, he knew the value of his subordinates. And I'm just going to briefly read this, or I could leave it to, I'll read it. I've totally lost sight of the organization of the party. When I find myself confronted by one or other of these achievements, I say to myself, by God, how has that developed? Or how that has, I'm not going to read it. I'm sorry. I'm kind of stumbling here.
Yeah, well, we'll let people read that themselves there. But,
absolutely.
And to jump in, the thing is with, as we'll find out with the Gauleiters, is you weren't there if you weren't at least competent at your job. Whereas again, you could be a lower level Nazi thug like us at the beginning and have risen to a position where you have no ability really whatsoever. You're just an evil piece of shit, and you just like torturing people. But this requires people to actually be pretty competent and also be loyal to the party. So choosing the right person, or for history's sake, the wrong person, but at the time the right person was key to this working.
Yeah, they had to have some ability, but I think more than anything, the loyalty had a lot to do with
Right.
it. And also they had to have the ability to foster the adoration of the people. They had to be able to connect with the people within their Gau.
Right.
So
they've got to have an element of that showmanship on some level that Hitler had, that manipulative kind of not brainwashing ability, but that ability to create an image and be followed.
Yeah, and a lot of them were very poor administrators. I mean, and they were extremely corrupt. But one thing that they often demonstrated, almost to a man, and even some who were quite old, I mean, in their 50s and 60s, they had tremendous energy. These guys were constantly overseeing rallies. They were doing groundbreaking events for a stretch of the Autobahn when it would come through their region. They were always running and making speeches. I don't remember the exact date, but by a certain year, Erich Koch, who we just talked about, he had delivered 742 speeches. And this was before Hitler had come to power. So before 1933. They were delivering just hundreds of speeches. Much of their responsibility was, building up the membership of the party within their Gaue, the number of members, the dues that they would have to take from all the membership. So they had a great deal of energy, and but not a hell of a lot of ability when it came to administration of vast numbers of people. And that proved itself later on when they put them in charge of occupied countries. Right. More on that later. Okay. Next slide. Just some examples of biographies of Gauleiter. Many of the best ones are coming out of Germany right now. And we have some here, one from one is in Czech and another in Polish on Albert Forster. But just some other examples. Again, my approach is I cram as many Gauleiter as I can and as many facts as I can about them into one book, but these are a more individualized approach.
Brilliant.
And then a fair number of Gauleiter wrote their memoirs after the war, which puts another arrow in the notion that only the victors write the history. Here we have Gauleiter Jordan on the left. He was in Soviet captivity after World War II for 10 years. And then on the right, we have one Gauleiter who will not be included in the presentation, but that's Alfred Edvard Frauenfeld, who served as Commissioner General in the Crimea during World War II. He was the Gauleiter of Vienna during the illegal period of the Nazi Party in Austria. Moving on, here is a map of the Gaue that was included in my first book. This was created by Tom Houlihan, and it just shows where things stood in 1942. Right. You have all the Gaue, and then you have some other territories on the far right here, like the General Government of Poland, Bialystok, and the District of Lemberg, which became a part of the General Government after 1941. But yeah, just kind of an outline of what they looked like, and then something a little more involved here. This shows, and I think it might not be too clear, but these I found on Wikipedia, and it's an excellent showing of the development of the Gaue very early on, within about the first year of the creation of the title. Here we see all of the darker brown ones are just the Gaue within the main body of Germany. And then over to the right, you see East Prussia, which is separated from the rest of Germany by the Polish corridor, which was created after the Treaty of Versailles. And then you see this little bit here, Danzig, which of course there was a huge dispute over Danzig, and that ultimately led to the outbreak of World War II. But Danzig is in a lighter color. That's because it was a free city and it was under the administration of the League of Nations. At this point, once again, none of these Gaue had any kind of true governmental function. They were strictly political units. And then in the next frame, we have 2 years later, we show the German Gaue, and then some recently created Gaue in the very bottom here. That is Austria. And that's, they called it the Hitlerbewegung or Hitler movement in Austria at that time. You see we have what's called the Westgau on the left that eventually was divided into the Gaue of Salzburg and Tyrol for Arlberg. I can never pronounce that. And then moving on, here we are at 1933. This is the day after Hitler came to, or the 2 days after Hitler came to power. Everything remains pretty much the same. And then in 37, here we are a day before the start of 1938, and the Austrian Gaue are missing. And that's because at that point they had been officially banned by the Austrian government. This was especially in the wake of the attempted putsch in Vienna when Engelbert Dollfuss was murdered. So all of those Gaue continued to exist undercover, but you don't see them officially on the map. And also, at this point, prior to the Anschluss of March 1938, none of the Austrian Gaue had any real authority. They were not officially recognized for diplomatic reasons by the Reich leadership of the NSDAP. But then come 31 August 1939, the Anschluss has already happened over a year before. All of these Austrian Gaue have been officially united with the Reich and appointed, various Gauleiter appointed. And I'll talk about them later. Yep. Next, then we have, by 1943, we have a lot of stuff that's happened here in earlier years. For example, at the far left here in France, a number of territories have been absorbed, annexed into Germany. You've got Alsace and Lorraine, you got the Duchy of Luxembourg. And then over here at the far right, you see that Danzig has expanded to become Danzig, West Prussia. And so the free city of Danzig has become the capital of that. Beneath that, a whole swath of Polish territory has been designated as Reichsgau Wartheland, or the Warthegau. And then a bit of territory from Poland has been tacked on to Silesia. The Gau of Silesia in January of 1941 becomes two Gaue, Lower Silesia and Upper Silesia. And I'm sorry, I know this is getting rambly, but I just think
no, it's good. And Phil Bosworth, regular viewer, said it's like a scan showing a cancer growing.
Beautifully put. I like that, and I'm going to use it.
Really, we can all use that. That's really,
that is perfect.
It is. It's like a medical chart with a doctor shaking his head, going, "This is how it's spreading." Yeah,
truly. And then, of course, with the occupation of the Sudetenland, we all know about Peace in Our Time and Chamberlain and all that. Well, the Sudetenland was granted to Germany, and it, of course, was called a Gau. And so you've got the Reichsgau Sudetenland, which straddles it. Actually, it's not contiguous up at its northeastern point, but there's a little bit of Sudetenland here and a little bit there. Then in March of 39, the rest of the Czech part, called Bohemia and Moravia of Czechoslovakia, has been absorbed as a protectorate. Finally, we have, after the campaign in Yugoslavia, some territories below the Gau of Styria have been tacked on. Those become Lower Styria, and they were full of Slovenians, and those Slovenians were forcibly deported by the Gauleiter. And finally, one little bit down at the very bottom, two extra bits of what was previously Italian territory were handed to the Gauleiter of the Tyrol and of Kärnten or Carinthia. And that's the Adriatic coastal zone here with Trieste as its capital. And then we have the South Tyrol basically becomes part of Tyrol Vorarlberg. And one more bit about the territories in the far west, Luxembourg, Alsace, and Lorraine. The Gauleiter in the Gaue adjoining those territories were designated as Chef der Zivilverwaltung, or Chiefs of Civil Administration. for those territories. And then a campaign of forced Germanization began. It was essentially cultural genocide and then actual physical genocide as they expelled people and executed dissidents, et cetera, et cetera. Moving to the next slide.
And thanks for that. That has been very informative. Just for people who are going into this, and some of the viewers are, like myself, with very little knowledge of just how the system works, is just explaining it like that by the maps has been very useful. So thanks, and people are learning a lot. So good.
Awesome. Next up, we have kind of the outline of, this is from the Organisationsbuch der NSDAP, which is the basically the manual of the party produced by Dr. Robert Lai. And it shows the hierarchy. Obviously, Hitler at the top. For some reason, Rudolf Hess is missing from this. This is from 1937. One would think that Hess should be there with his staff of the Deputy Führer, but it's not. But in any case, there were a bunch of guys called Reichsleiter beneath Hitler, and the Reichsleiter handled various, I guess you'd call them portfolios. He had a Reichsleiter for the Reich Labor Service, a Reichsleiter for propaganda, that was Goebbels, et cetera, et cetera. Beneath that, you had the Gauleiter. He was basically the third ranking official in the party. And beneath him was the Stellvertretender Gauleiter, or Deputy Gauleiter. Again, each Gau consisted of Kreise, and those were led by Kreisleiter, then Ortsgruppenleiter. Beneath that, Zellenleiter, and then at the actual block level, you had the Blockleiter, who was responsible for basically spying on all the people within the neighborhood block, collecting party dues, doing charity drives, you name it, or I don't know, snitching on Jews and making sure the apartments went to Aryans, so-called. Wow. Then you have the on the right, same book. It's the staff of a Gauleiter consisted of people who handled all kinds of different matters. You had a Gau Propagandaleiter, obviously responsible for propaganda. You had the Gau Presseleiter, who was in charge of the press. And each Gauleiter, they love to have their own newspapers. They love to provide their forewords to books. They publish books celebrating their accomplishments. Very vain, obviously. And here's an example. I don't know if I'll be able to show it here, but big swastika on the front. It's called Kämpfen wir. We fight, or we fought. Kämpften wir. And this is from the Gau of Hessen-Nassau. And it's lavishly illustrated, and it just shows the glory days of what they called the Kampfzeit, or the time of struggle of the party. So just one example of many. So yeah, that's the structure of the Gaua, and then you've got his subordinate offices, and then the little boxes outside of that with the dots. Those are affiliated organizations of the party. You've got the SA, NSKK, SS, Hitler Youth. They did not exercise, the Gauleiter did not exercise direct control over those organizations, but they had a great deal of influence over them. And they were responsible for, in the case of the Hitler Youth, for example, Gauleiter often liked to have youth rallies, and they would be involved in the organization of those rallies. With regard to the SS and the Gestapo and the police, while they didn't exercise direct control, they had influence, and they were able to say, I would like to see the Jews in my region disappear. They couldn't just on their own initiative deport Jews. They didn't have the logistical abilities to do that. They didn't have the infrastructure for it, but the SS and police did. So oftentimes Gauleiter would induce or influence the police and SS to carry out those activities.
And this is going to sound like a really dumb question, Michael, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How similar or different was this system to what had existed in previous incarnations of the German government? I mean, do they adapt a system that was basically traditional, the way the Germans managed their country, or is this completely revolutionary?
I can't really speak to how with regard to this specific party, I mean, there were two and it's hard to explain all of this. I mean, even in a short amount of time or just in general, I would have a difficult time explaining the duality of your party system as opposed to the traditional Reich civil service.
Right.
And, you know, they were definitely relying on systems that were already present. If you want to talk about, well, you've had a fellow on discussing the Deutsche Reichsbahn, the German railway system. That was a very tradition-bound organization. The man in charge of it, Julius Dorpmüller, and his state secretary Wilhelm Kleinmann, they were officials of the Kaiser's time, and so the infrastructure that they built, it was largely already there. The systems of governance were already in place, but they were just retooled in such a way that we could have this genocide come about.
Yeah, so
yeah,
swallowed up and kind of consumed by maybe. Yeah, I mean, I remember that show about the railways. Is that Christian was talking about the fact that it was the German railways have been quite union based. They were quite sort of socially minded, quite progressive in terms of the way they treated their workers, and yet it was swallowed up by this mechanism and kind of became something very different to what it had been, and yet was still resembling it in terms of the bare bones of its structure. If that doesn't sound paradoxical, that statement there.
No, it's very paradoxical, but it's very true. So yeah, they did rely very much on pre-existing structures of government.
Brilliant. Well, back to you.
Alrighty. Next up, we have again there was the regular Reich government, the Land government. The Länder were the provinces of Germany that already were a structure that existed before Hitler came to power, and then there was the party. And a number of the Gauleiter were appointed as Reichsstatthalter. There were 12 of them appointed from March through May. Later on, that number grew to 23 after Austria and some other territories were taken. But yeah, some of them had actual governmental functions in addition to their political function. They were Reichsstatthalter, is the term.
Yep.
And next we have the Austrian Gauleiter. They were formally appointed May 1938. Most of them had been Gauleiters in the illegal Nazi party leading up to that time. Yeah, they had been working to subvert their own government, and so that's why they were rewarded. Here you have Friedrich Reiner at the top. He was first appointed as Gauleiter of Salzburg. Then August Eigruber, who headed the Gau of Upper Austria, Oberösterreich. Under that, Hugo Uri, then Siegfried Uberreiter, Odilo Globocnik, much more about him later, Franz Hofer, and then Hubert Klausner, who is not included here. He died in February 1939. But yeah, basically a particularly nasty bunch, especially Globocnik, because his infamy arose from his actions after he was fired from his job as a Gauleiter, when he became the head of the SS and police in the Lublin district and headed the Einsatz Reinhard extermination camps.
Thank you.
And we have Reichsleiter Martin Bormann. Now, he was the essentially the deputy of Rudolf Hess until Hess flew to Scotland in May of 1941. And then he became the head of what became known as the Parteikanzlei, or party chancellery. Basically, he was the filter I mentioned earlier, that Gauleiter, in order to meet with Hitler, had to go through Bormann. Bormann issued his directives in Hitler's name, and basically there was no contact with Hitler unless it was through Bormann. So you had two different types of Gauleiter. You had Bormann men, who were those who had been trained as administrators. They were more highly educated than the old timers. And then you had the older Gauleiter. It's the ones who were in charge of Gaue before 1933. The less educated types, they were mainly rewarded for loyalty.
And kind of opportunist, possibly more sort of just seeing a new kid on the block, so to speak, and thinking that they would rather be part of it than not be part of it. So just, you know, switched to the new system. Is that kind of how it worked?
Not quite sure how you mean.
Well, I mean, the old Gauleiters who've been there pre this era, did they just kind of see it as they wanted to continue in their jobs, so they just bought into it because they wanted their own personal ambition, or were they necessarily loyal to the ideology?
They were genuinely loyal to the ideals.
Right.
Yeah, I would say so. Not a heck of a lot of opportunism among these men, at least not at that stage. Okay. Once they got into power, they became, power corrupting. All power.
Okay.
Great, the great power corrupted them. Yeah. But they were, first and foremost, they were ideologically aligned with Hitler and the tenets of National Socialism.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. And then one very important term for this presentation is Reichsverteidigungskommissare, which henceforth I'm going to use RVK because that's a mouthful. So they were responsible, Gauleiter were responsible for all civil defense matters within their jurisdiction. And at the end of August 1939, something was created called the Ministerial Council for the Defense of the Reich under the leadership of Hermann Göring. And beneath him, he had several Reich ministers who handled, there was the Minister of Interior, Minister of Economics, and a few others. Beneath them were 15 of these RVKs, Gauleiter, who were appointed to handle all civil defense within the Wehrkreise, or defense districts, into which Germany was divided. The army headed these. The army had these defense districts, and there were only 15. So that, but by this time we had over 35 Gauleiter. So there was a built-in jurisdictional conflict. Suddenly, a Gauleiter would be, even though he was within the same Gau as the other Gauleiter, that Gauleiter, I'm getting confused now. I'm so sorry. Basically, a fellow Gauleiter would be designated as RVK, and he would be subordinated in civil defense matters to that RVK. So there were 15 of them initially, and then it expanded with the invasion of Poland after it was occupied. And then in November 1942, every Gauleiter, except for the head of the Auslandsorganisation, became an RVK. The structure no longer dealt with defense districts or Wehrkreise. It was strictly each Gau handled its own responsibilities for civil defense. So that involved cooperation, liaison with the army generals and others in command of the Wehrkreise, ensuring uniformity among civil authorities with regard to Reich defense. They were responsible for air raid protection, to include air raid shelters, cleanup of after air raids, the evacuation of the population ahead of air raids or immediately after them. They had a program called the Kinderlandverschickung, which was a plan to remove children from these endangered areas. So that was under the command of a Gauleiter, Baldur von Schirach, and over 1 million children were evacuated from these particularly endangered zones that endured a lot of air raids. They were responsible for mobilizing local manpower for war-related work. As the war went on, they would often be involved in, I'm getting ahead of myself, never mind that. They were involved in the employment of foreign laborers. One of the Gauleiter, Fritz Sauckel, who's pretty well known as he was hanged at Nuremberg, he was the general plenipotentiary for the allocation of labor, and that put him in charge of, dredging up slave laborers from all over Europe, 7.5 million to 8 million people. So beneath him, each Gauleiter was made a representative of Sauckel in that capacity. Then 1944 to 45, there was a lot of fortification construction, tank ditches, anti-tank ditches, and obstacles that were built to impede the Allied and Soviet advance. Gauleiter during the RVK were responsible for overseeing the rationing of food and other resources. Often they did a lot of hoarding of it themselves, and a lot of them were involved in the black market, but they were also in charge of suppressing the black market. Okay. And again, these Gauleiter often, they didn't have a great loyalty to the Reich as a whole. Their first loyalty, other than to Hitler as this abstract leader figure, their first loyalty was to their own Gau, and that would ensure their own popularity. They wanted the people to like them. After air raids, they would often ensure that people would get special rations, gifts, blankets, cognac, you name it, for certain people, usually people who were, high up in the party, people with some influence, so they would benefit. So it was all about popularity, really. And then you had a great deal of involvement of the Gauleiter in the administration of occupied Eastern territories. And again, it was a matter of primarily of loyalty, but also these individuals often demonstrated some administrative ability. So in Norway, you had the infamous Josef Terboven, made himself very unpopular in short order. Erich Koch in the Ukraine, who I've discussed already. In the Baltic states and Belarusia, you had Hinrich Lohse, the Gauleiter Schleswig-Holstein. I could read these all off, but I think
people can pause it and look at it. And I'm just going to jump in here because I think MJ and NH made a good point there that I'd like you to kind of address. And he said, it is so important to hear about this. So many people think it's a mystery how Germany became a totalitarian state. These guys all the way. And it does show you just how the mechanism spread. We so often, as we said at the beginning, we think of the Third Reich as just being Hitler, and of course it's not. It's this massive, great organization that, as you said, goes down to individual, block commanders, deciding who gets, rounded up, and it's a spider's web with a spider at the middle of it, but it's massive, isn't it? And it's important to understand how thoroughly they infected the country, or the Reich, I suppose is the better term.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thanks for that. So back to you. It's just enthralling. Thank you.
Yeah. Woody, just a time check. How long have we been going?
We've been doing 45 minutes nearly, so we're well into it.
Wow.
No,
okay.
But we're it's good. We're loving it. So don't worry. We perhaps will be conscious of the fact that we are burning time, but it's good.
Okay. Cool. So the actions of the Gauleiter I just mentioned in these annexed territories. Here on the right, we have Gustav Simon, who was the Gauleiter of Koblenz-Trier, redesignated as Gau Moselland in 1942, and he was the chief of civil administration in Luxembourg. Very small country, very little known about it. It's incredible how much damage one man can do to a country, and the suffering of Luxembourg, it could fill a huge book. Just horrific things were done to the Jewish population there, mass deportations, basically rendering Luxembourg Judenrein or Judenfrei, free of Jews. His goal was to completely Germanize Luxembourg. That was also the case with Robert Wagner in Alsace and Joseph Burkel in Lorraine. They wanted to ensure that only German would be spoken. All of what they would consider subhuman riffraff is an actual term that Heinrich Himmler used once regarding the non-Aryan population in Lorraine. So they wanted to clear out people like the Slovenes in Untersteiermark, Lower Styria, Arthur Greiser in the Vartaland. He forbade any contact between Germans and Poles, had just an incredible anti-Polish complex resulting from his bitterness about his homeland being taken over and made part of Poland after World War I. Then a great deal of military conscription. There was a large number of French-speaking people found their way into the Wehrmacht. They were forced to join. And then any who deserted. Gustav Zeeman happened to write to Heinrich Himmler requesting specifically the execution by the SS of any Luxembourg deserters in the German army. They rounded people up for forced labor, obviously. They deported the Jews and the Roma, others to concentration camps. So they just made a horrific name for themselves in the annexed territories and the occupied territories. But they were not all cowards. As we were discussing recently, Woody, they, even an Oscar Dirlewanger and other particularly sadistic Nazis had a great deal of physical courage. Yeah. So here we have just a small number of the Gauleiter are pictured, the ones who served in the military in any capacity. The vast majority of them served in the military. Here we're covering a total of 59 men, I think. And there we've got 47 who served in one form or another in the military in World War I and World War II. And I'll be talking about more of these guys later if we get to them.
Yeah, and the question came up about how many have served in the First World War, and I'm glad you made the distinction that you can be part of this evil mechanism, and you can definitely be a horrible individual, but still possess the quality of bravery. A nasty person can still be brave. Again, we like to pigeonhole these people as kind of being sniveling little kind of rattish, horrible, evil, cowardly people, and some of them were, but some of them, had these qualities that you don't want to say you admire them, but it humanizes them, as you said right at the beginning, Michael. It allows us to understand that they are nuanced human beings, and just labeling them as just being thugs or evil is too simplistic. There's much more to it than that.
Yeah, it makes the history a lot more interesting too if we know the full story.
Yeah.
So real quickly, I'll just say. Let's see, starting top left, we've got Franz Kuchera. Here he is as a mountain trooper, briefly served as a Gauleiter in Austria, Carinthia. And then he was ultimately assassinated in Warsaw when he was the SS and police leader there in 1944. Next, we have Baldur von Schirach, formerly head of the Hitler Youth, Gauleiter of Vienna. And here he is in his army uniform as a lieutenant. And then we have Dr. Gustav Adolf Scheel, wearing the uniform of a private in a flak unit of the Luftwaffe. He eventually became Gauleiter of Salzburg. He was the Reich student leader, and he was a doctor of medicine. Bottom left, Robert Wagner during World War I. He was the Gauleiter of Alsace-Baden in World War II. Then Franz Schwede, the Gauleiter of Pomerania or Pommern. He was a naval machinist mate in World War I. Then Dr. Friedrich Reiner, Gauleiter of Salzburg, also a mountain trooper. Then Karl Hanke, the final Reichsführer SS, was highly decorated for service as a Panzer Company commander in France in 1940. And then Dr. Siegfried Wiebereiter, here pictured in Narvik in 1940, Gauleiter of Styria. All right, and we often think of the SS only when it comes to the Holocaust. There's been some great work in recent years to shatter that myth. We have, of course, the Vernichtungskrieg exhibition in Germany in the 1990s, did a lot for that. Our own Dr. Philip Blood has done incredible work, as has Victoria, last name forgotten.
Taylor.
Thank you, Taylor. Both of whom have shown the criminality of the Luftwaffe.
Yeah.
The Gauleiter contributed greatly to the final solution of the Jewish question. During the 20s and 30s, they were some of the prime movers when it came to anti-Semitic propaganda. In 1929, a Gauleiter called Otto Helmuth was involved in trying to pin the blame for the rape and murder of a young child on a local Jew. And he actually made speeches to that effect. He launched a campaign that went on for weeks. And that's largely how he made his name in the 1920s, and then eventually became an influential Gauleiter. When the Jewish business boycott was enacted in April 1933, it was largely the local Gauleiters who were responsible for enforcing it. A number of them were involved directly in Kristallnacht, the pogrom of November 1938. In fact, when that occurred, the German legation secretary in Paris, Ernst von Marat, when he was assassinated by a 17-year-old Jewish boy, Herschel Greenspun, on 7th of November, they were about to begin the annual commemoration of the Munich Putsch in 1938. So Goebbels was making a speech to the assembled Nazi leaders, and that's when word came down that von Marat had died of his injuries, and that there were some spontaneous demonstrations against the local Jews in cities in the West, like Kassel. So he ordered, not quite ordered, but he encouraged the Gauleiter and Reichsleiter who were present to get to their phones and basically order a spontaneous pogrom nationwide against the Jews. So Gauleiter played an important role in that. Franz Hofer in Tyrol, Austrian, he actually ordered the creation of a death squad of SS and SA men to murder the most influential Jewish figures in the city of Innsbruck. So they actually cut throats and threw bodies into the river. And then in a number of cases, notably in Pomerania, the Gauleiter there, Franz Schwede, influenced the SS and Gestapo to round up all of the Jews he could find in Stettin, his capital, and also in the city of Schneidemühle, and deport them. And a number of them froze to death in the trains. This was in February of 1940, well before the final solution of the Jewish question. Then, in the case of Arthur Greiser in the Reichsgau Wartheland, the annexed Polish territory, the very first purpose-built extermination camp was established on his initiative, and at least 145,000 Jews were gassed there using gassing vans. So their involvement in the Holocaust was greater than I think is widely known. Most people, again, as I say, they only think in terms of the SS and the Gestapo as having any real involvement in this. But without the encouragement of the Gauleiter, without them leaning on the local SS and police authorities and on Himmler himself, it wouldn't have been as easy to clear these Gaue of Jews and declare them Jew-free.
Wow. Yeah, thank you.
And then again, I also want to say another example in 1940 of very early Jewish deportations was in Alsace and Lorraine, where the respective Gauleiter Robert Wagner and Josef Burkel all at once just ordered the ousting of all the Jews they could find in their Gaue and in those territories into unoccupied France. And of course, eventually that unoccupied portion became occupied in 1942, and those Jews who were being held in Vichy French camps ended up on their way to Auschwitz. Then we have a speech by Himmler. I will not read the whole thing, but I am planning to upload this whole presentation to my Patreon, so people are free to read this, but it's a very interesting excerpt from a speech that Himmler gave to the assembled Reichsleiter and Gauleiter in the city of Posen. He had delivered a similar speech 2 days earlier, and very explicitly, although not too explicitly, he was careful with his language, but he basically made clear that the Jews were being exterminated, and explicitly used the word in this case. So the brief sentence, "The Jews must be exterminated," is easy to pronounce, but the demands on those who have to put it into practice are the hardest and most difficult in the world. So here he was whining to the assembled Gauleiter and Reichsleiter about the hardships.
The hardship of carrying out a policy and how difficult it was. I feel such empathy for the guy. The poor burden this guy had, he said in the most sarcastic tone there. But it's people are loving it. People are already saying how this is going to be one of the most important shows I've done on the channel. It's like a document of that people will be drawing on in the future. So thank you, Michael, for sharing it with us. But
thank you. But I got to say, I got to be honest here. Full disclosure, I'm a little nervous.
Oh, you are. It's good. You're absolutely. As two people have already said, you're knocking it out of the park. So there we are. It's if this is your worst performance, you're doing really well. This is the Stanley Matthews FA Cup final. Well, not that you'll know what that means, but you're having a really good performance. Don't
Thanks
worry.
a lot. All right, so here we have a few more examples of the darker side. We have illustrations from a children's book, which, as you can see, is a disgusting children's book. And on the wall behind, you see the Der Stürmer. Der Stürmer was publicly disseminated and put in these glass and metal or wooden frames called Stürmerkasten. And pretty sure just about every city had a Stürmerkasten. And Julius Streicher, the Gauleiter of Franconia, or Franken, he was, of course, the founder and chief editor of Der Stürmer. So it's just an example of the extent to which Jews or Gauleiter were involved in anti-Semitic propaganda. And then we have the results of this kind of propaganda on the right. The same Gauleiter that I mentioned who had accused a Jew of murdering a child in 1929, this photo is taken in his Gau. That was Dr. Otto Helmuth, who was a dentist by profession. The Gau is Gau Unterfranken, or Lower Franconia. And these are Jews being rounded up based on their age and physical condition that you can see here. We can pretty confidently speculate that they were sent to the extermination camp of Sobibor on July 6, 1942.
All right. Yep.
Next, Gauleiter were heavily involved in the murder of Allied Airmen, and many of them encouraged it. Some physically participated in it themselves. Two of them were executed for it. Friedrich Hildebrandt from Mecklenburg-Schwerin was one. Robert Wagner of Alsace-Baden, who comes up a lot in this discussion, he was executed in part for the murder of British airmen who had parachuted. The loudest voice in advocating for this was Joseph Goebbels, who made many speeches in which, and he ultimately urged the propaganda ministry to not refer to them as combatants, as legitimate military aviators. These were terror flyers, murder flyers, Huns of the air. Never mind the fact that, as was well known, the Luftwaffe had conducted all kinds of horrible bombing attacks going all the way back to Guernica, Rotterdam, Coventry, Belgrade. The only reason they weren't able to do the same level of damage as the USAAF and the RAF is they never developed a 4-engine bomber. They didn't have.
Yeah, their technology didn't permit them to do it, but their intentions were just the same. It's just they were limited by the technology at the time. But yeah, as Victoria Taylor says.
Yeah, they could perpetrate an awful lot of horror with just 2 engines.
Yeah.
So I'm going to read some of these here. Martin Borman issued a letter to the Nazi Party chain of command and said, in recent weeks, English and North American airmen have repeatedly shot at children playing, women and children working in the fields, peasants working on farms, wagons on the road, etc., during low-level strafing attacks. This is the most awful way to murder defenseless civilians, especially women and children. It has often occurred that downed crew members of such aircraft were immediately arrested and lynched on the spot by the outraged population. Police and criminal prosecution of the people involved were omitted. And next we have another Gauleiter, Albert Hofmann, issued a decree in the last months of the war regarding Jagdbomber or fighter bomber pilots. Jagdbomber pilots who were shot down are in principle not to be protected against the fury of the people. I expect from all police officers that they will refuse to lend their protection to these gangster types. Authorities acting in contradiction to the popular sentiment will have to account to me. All police and gendarmerie officials are to be informed immediately of this, my attitude. He served virtually no time at all in prison and made a fortune in business after the war. And his son also became well known as a businessman and a right-wing politician. So one of the most infuriating aspects of this is the lack of accountability. I mean, very few of these people were held to any kind of account, and most of them died as free men. So moving
Yeah, I
on.
mean that comes up a lot, and it came up with our show with Dr. Waitman Bjorn a few months ago. Is that, alas, the percentage of Nazis responsible for these heinous crimes actually tried in any kind of legal system is tiny. It's less than 5%.
Yeah, indeed.
Tragic.
So in the last phases of the war, everything falling apart, of course, and the Gauleiter in October 1944 all became commanders of their own, essentially, private army, or Volkssturm. Now, this was an army, as it were, of men that were, or boys of 16 all the way up to men of 60. And they were poorly armed, poorly trained. Ultimately, somewhere in the neighborhood of 175,000 of them were killed in the last few months of the war. The Gauleiter were making speeches at every opportunity, exhorting the populace to fight to the death, fight to the last man and the last bullet. A number of them actually designated their Gaue as Festungen, or fortresses. Key example being Karl Hanke in Lower Silesia, with his headquarters in Breslau. They held out in Breslau for over 2 months, and he exhorted the population to fight. He had officials who wanted to raise the white flag executed. Many were executed in those final months, and the city was almost completely destroyed, the city of Breslau, because of his attempts at resistance. And then there was something called the Nero Decree, which was issued 19 March 1945. Hitler demanded a scorched earth policy that the Gauleiter were to implement. And as you see here, some followed it, others didn't. Albert Speer, in his capacity as Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, desperately sought to have these Gauleiters not follow through with the Nero Decree. He had some cooperation from some of the more rational ones, not so much from the others. A lot of bridges were blown up. A lot of the infrastructure was blown up. And basically Hitler believed that the German people had failed him. They had never deserved him. And so he didn't give a rip if he burned the whole thing down.
Mm. Yeah. What can you say? Yeah.
Bit more on the Volkssturm. Here they are being sworn in Berlin. Goebbels made a big rousing speech, of course. And you see middle-aged men with MG-34s and Panzerfäuste. The Panzerfaust was essentially the weapon for the Volkssturm. And then the armband, of course, of the Deutsche Volkssturm Wehrmacht. Then a speech that I will not read, but this is Erich Koch again, exhorting the population to join the Volkssturm, to be ready for action, and to fight to the death for Hitler. A little more on the Nero Befehl, or the Nero Decree, just some excerpts, or an excerpt from it, and a picture of the man who tried to sabotage it.
And I urge people to go back and watch this and pause on these slides and read the information. But we'll keep on going with the presentation now.
Okay, and then we have the fates of the 59 men covered here. 23 of them died of natural causes. Well, I should say 23 after the war, and 3 died of illness during the war. We had 15 suicides. One of those is not entirely confirmed. That's Alfred Meyer. He was found dead on a riverbank. In fact, I know a guy who actually owns the uniform he was apparently wearing when that happened, including the Golden Party badge, which is rusty from having been submerged in water. Then we have 9 were executed by the Allies, or formerly Nazi-occupied nations, like Poland especially, and the Soviet Union. Let's see. 2 were actually executed by the SS. One of them for defeatism, and the other, well, just because he had made himself very unpopular. And if I have time, I'll get to him, but I don't think I'm going to. 2 were actually killed in action, showed some level of courage in the final days of the war. One of them saw Karl Gerland, saw that there was really no hope. He asked for the evacuation of his Gau. It was refused. So he joined an army unit and was killed in action. 2 were killed or died in captivity, including Karl Hanke, the final Reichsfuhrer SS. We had 1 assassinated, again, Kuchera is the SS and police leader in Warsaw. 1 of them died in a Polish prison in 1986. That was Erich Koch. And then an obscure fellow called Metzner died of unknown causes. More on him later. All right, some pictures, group pictures of the Gauleiter. I start my book, or my most recent book. It begins with, actually that's my Stormtroop book, begins with a lot of group photos. I'm going to do that with future editions of my Gallighter series, just to show them as a group. This is 1929, the Führer Leadership Council, the Führer Leadership Conference of the NSDAP in Weimar, 1929. I'm going to barrel through these now. Just a bunch of groups of Gauleiter, filmed, photographed by his private photographer, Hitler's private photographer, Hoffmann.
And we had a question earlier, which I realized might be quite a complex one to answer, but was there loyalty shown from Gauleiter to Gauleiter, or was there competition with them? How do they function with each other?
There was very little cooperation between them. They were all very jealous of their respective areas of influence. So there were a great many of jurisdictional conflicts. I think when they got together for commemorations of the Munich Putsch, and they were all in the beer hall slugging beer, they looked genuinely happy to be among themselves. But really the best source for this sort of thing, even though he was not an unbiased observer, would be the diaries of Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels always talks about the internal conflicts of the NSDAP, how much this or that Gauleiter hated another. Gauleiter were coming to him constantly, and other officials as well, complaining about this or that rival. So yeah, it is a rather difficult to answer question. So I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Yep, that's fine. That's as good an answer as I was expecting. So that's good.
All right. More groups here. Again, I mentioned Hans Schemm at the very beginning. He was the Gauleiter of what eventually became Gau Bayreuth, and very dynamic personality. He's also the Reich teachers leader. And these are photos this is a photo from his funeral in 1935. So you got some key personalities here from left to right: Rudolf Jordan, Karl Rover, Wilhelm Murr, Erich Koch, and I'm rambling, so I'm going to move on. Then a conference. This is immediately after the debacle at Stalingrad, February 7th, 1945. All of the loyal Gauleiter came to meet with their Führer. And the next group of pictures, these are photos from October 7th, 1943, Heinrich Himmler's birthday, and also the day after the men in these photos heard Himmler explicitly tell them about the extermination of the Jews. So it's interesting to see the faces of these men the day after having heard something like that. They seem to be quite comfortable and unperturbed. In fact, even a little self-satisfied. Here on the far left, you have Josef Bürkel. Behind him, Franz Schwede and August Eigruber. And then I believe this photo, which I just recently found online, was taken shortly after the 20 July 1944 attempt to assassinate Hitler. I'm not positive about the date, but it's Hitler meeting with all the Reichsleiter and the Gauleiter. And far in the front there, you can see unmistakably Heinrich Himmler. Moving on, final meeting between Hitler and all of the Gauleiter, Reichsleiter, and heads of various other organizations. We have from right to left, Gauleiter Josef Grohe, and then the NSFK, the National Socialist Flying Corps leader, Keller, Alfred Keller, the Reich Minister of Justice, Otto Tirak, then Paul Wegener, Gauleiter Karl Kaufmann, Dr. Friedrich Reiner, Franz Hofer, Hitler, August Eigruber, and Albert Forster. And Hitler is looking pretty rough these days. I think you can see, it's hard to tell from a snapshot, but I think Friedrich Reiner might be a little taken aback at the appearance of his Führer. I mean, by this time, his arm was shaking. He looked extremely haggard. He was not the Führer of yesteryear. And then I'm not going to read all of these. There are just too many. We've got 59 little capsule biographies, but I will focus on a couple of them. This one's particularly interesting. Ernst Wilhelm Bohle was the head of the foreign organization, or the Auslandsorganisation of the NSDAP. So that placed him in charge of all of the local groups of Nazi party officials in different countries and different regions. You even had an AO branch in Palestine. You had one in New York City, throughout South America, South Africa. All over the world, the AO had its tentacles. So they would advance the interests of German people living in foreign countries. And interestingly enough, he was the only Gauleiter born in England. And so he was raised and educated in England and South Africa, where his father was a distinguished professor of electrical engineering. And he was eventually placed in charge of the Landesgruppe, or the national group of the Auslandsorganisation in South Africa. Bohle's father was. And he's also the only Gauleiter who fully pleaded guilty during the Nuremberg trials. He was tried by the U.S. military tribunal at Nuremberg in the trial of mainly government officials, the so-called Wilhelmstrasse case. So he only got 5 years, and that was for his membership in the SS. But really, I mean, he was definitely an avowed anti-Semite. He made a number of speeches, especially when German officials and party officials were assassinated overseas or in other countries. So when David Frankfurter, who I believe was a Jewish student, shot the leader of the Auslandsorganisation in Switzerland, Wilhelm Gustloff, in 1936, he was eulogized by Gauleiter Bohle. And when the same thing happened to Ernst Vollmerath, when he was shot by Herschel Greenspan in 1938, Bohle eulogized him. So much of his anti-Semitic language dealt with the claim that Jews were murderers who killed German officials overseas. And then we have a photo of him being sentenced at Nuremberg. However, he was released the next year. If I can go back to the previous slide. Yeah, he was released the same year, only served about 7 years or 7 months of imprisonment. Of course, he'd been in captivity since 1945, so that was considered time served. And he died in 1960. He was quite young at the time, 57. Later married his defense counsel. Then we have one of the worst of the lot. Fritz Bracht was Gauleiter in the Gau, where the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination concentration camp facility was located. So when Himmler came to visit, he was greeted by Bracht. This happened at least on 2 occasions, March 1941 and July of 1942. On the second occasion, Himmler actually witnessed the gassing of some Dutch Jews. A transport of Dutch Jews had just arrived, and Bracht was supposedly present with him throughout that occasion, during the actual gassing. Toward the end of the war, he was very ill, and many of his duties were handled by deputies. And then ultimately, he had a heart attack, and very late in the war, like a few days before the end, he attempted to resume his office as Gauleiter. is kind of insane because the entire territory was already taken over by the Red Army by this time. He was only going to be Gauleiter on paper. So Field Marshal Schorner had him placed in protective custody, and shortly after that, he committed suicide together with his wife. Here we have a very rare picture in very poor condition showing Bracht at center. You can tell by the light uniform with Heinrich Himmler and Rudolf Höss, the commander of Auschwitz. Then behind Höss, second from the right, we have Hans Kammler, who was the head of the construction branch of the SS Economic Administration Office, main office. And then at far right is the man who actually was responsible for constructing the crematoria at Auschwitz. That's Karl Bischoff. So Bracht was very much involved in it. Oh, and to Bracht's immediate left, his right, is the higher SS and police leader in the local area, Ernst Heinrich Schmauser. Then we have an interesting
gallery in that one, isn't it? Honestly.
Oh, indeed. Some of the worst of the worst. And then we have side by side two very interesting things, at least to me. We have kind of a cheerful celebration here. Bracht is awarding citizenship certificates to young ethnic Germans who have previously lived under Soviet occupation. So they've brought these ethnic Germans into his Gau. It's summer 1944. And basically saying, welcome home to the Reich. You're now no longer in these previously Soviet occupied areas. You're now back home. But then just a few months later, in the next group of clips, not clips, but screenshots, we see him in his Volkssturm uniform, in a more militarized role. And he's delivering a speech to the newly created Volkssturm, exhorting them to fight to the end. And so these poor folks in the left side, this is what they have to face now. They have to face, they may have been taken out of, their formerly Soviet-controlled areas, but now the Red Army is coming for them. So... Then we have Josef Bürkel. He was the man who coordinated the Saar plebiscite in January 1935. The Saarland, with all of its coal fields, was previously, thanks to the Treaty of Versailles, under the control of the League of Nations. So it was brought to a referendum in 1935 over whether or not the people wished to return to the Reich, return to Germany. And the man who coordinated all of that was Josef Bürkel. It was, I think, a 90% demand of the population to be returned to Germany. And so that happened. And then the same thing occurred again in April 1938. Another referendum was held under the control of Bürkel, and something like 90% of Austrians demanded to be united with the German Reich. So whether or not those are accurate, difficult to say, but I will say that gosh, some of the worst Nazis seem to have come out of Austria. So I think they were, in fact, honestly desiring to be unified with Austria.
Yeah.
And then in 1938, Bürkel ordered the creation of a central office for Jewish immigration. Here again, we have a Gauleiter just deeply involved in what became the final solution of the Jewish question. It was placed under the leadership of Franz Walter Stahlecker of the Gestapo. And Stahlecker, of course, later became head of Einsatzgruppe A. So here he is getting his start in the final solution under Bürkel. And then the actual duties of the post were headed by Adolf Eichmann. And at that point, the goal was to encourage emigration of Jews. So then in 1940, I should say in 1939, after Odilo Globochnik was ousted at the start of the year, Bürkel became Gauleiter of Vienna and held that post until the summer of 1940. Then he was placed in charge of the civil administration in Lorraine And as I mentioned earlier, he was deeply involved in attempting to Germanize the population and the region, and was also involved in the deportation of approximately 6,500 Jews from Gau, the area of Lorraine and Alsace. And he died under uncertain circumstances. He was certainly sick, but he was under a great deal of stress. And largely this was because of the Allied advance, which was bearing down on the region he controlled. And photo of him during another one he served in World War I. And more photos. Oops. An interesting image of his grave. I only noticed this morning, and that's just this enormous block with his huge name crushing down on the other members of his family, including, third from the left, we have the grave of Sepp Birkel, who died as a fighter pilot at the age of, I believe, 23. And that grave site is still in existence today, which is interesting to me. Then we have, well, I'm going to skip through a few because we're probably kind of pressed for time. Moving back.
About 15 minutes or so more would be kind of ideal. We can always bring you back and do some of the other guys later on, but it's fascinating. People are absolutely loving it's the wrong word, but appreciating the depth of information. But yeah, no, it's great stuff, Michael.
I've got to admit, I'm having a hard time with the slides here. They're trying to go for, hoping this will stay. Okay, this is August Eigruber, certainly one of the most infamous, and that's because he was probably the most intimately connected with a concentration camp. He visited the Mauthausen camp, which he had been instrumental in creating many times. He was very close with its commandant, Franz Zierreis. He personally witnessed and ordered mass killings there. His entire life, as I note here, was spent in service to the Nazi movement, his entire adult life. He was a mere 15 years old when he became a youth leader in the Nazi movement in 1922. And that, of course, was in Austria at a time when it was difficult to be a Nazi. He was imprisoned many times throughout the 30s and ultimately was sentenced to death at Dachau and executed at Landsberg in 1947. And there's a number of photos. These are quite well known. He was like, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but many of these Gauleiter were members of Nazi party affiliated organizations like the SS, the SA, the NSKK, National Socialist Motorist Corps. And they were granted high rank, although it was almost invariably honorary rank. They had no real function, but the uniform was a matter of great prestige for them. And so in this case, you see Gauleiter Eigruber, who would customarily be wearing brown, is instead wearing the black uniform of the SS for this visit of Heinrich Himmler to the Mauthausen concentration camp. So there were two major visits in 1941 by Himmler. The first one, Eigruber wears this black SS uniform. The second one, bottom right photo, he's at far right wearing his party uniform. And that's an interesting series of images in itself. I won't digress too much, but I will say in May 1941, Himmler invited a whole lot of Waffen-SS luminaries, the type that a lot of people think were mere soldiers who were fighting for their country. And they aren't aware that a lot of these guys visited the Mauthausen concentration camp, one of the very worst. And in this series of photos, they're just all smiles. They're seeing everything going on within the camp, all the brutality that was going on. And they seem to be unperturbed by it. And then here is Eigruber, who lied through his teeth throughout his trial, but was also very defiant. And he he went to his grave, went to his death with some degree of courage, I'd say, but just an odious individual. And like so many of the Gauleiter, he talked a tough game and talked about turning his region into a fortress. He had people executed. He created special court-martials to court-martial defeatists and anyone who didn't show faith in final victory. But when the proverbial shit hit the fan at the very end, he had no qualms about jumping in a car and escaping. So one of many such cases. This one, just an absolutely repugnant guy, Friedrich Karl Florian, who was experienced almost no punishment whatsoever. But he became very angry in the 60s when a number of books referred to crimes he had committed, including the execution of deserters at the end of World War II. Of course, he himself eventually deserted and then attempted suicide several times in custody. But he attempted to sue a number of authors for saying bad things about his service as a Gauleiter. And yet, here we are again, rather brave in World War I. He was a military aviator, a pilot. And how are we for time?
We should kind of wrap things up in 10 minutes or so, Rio. But just do a part two. We invite you back, and you can carry on going through the list. But yeah, in order to I want this to get traction later on the channel, so I think we should bring things to an end.
Absolutely
soon.
Happy to do it.
So, yeah.
All right. So real quickly, this is Albert Forster, Gauleiter of Danzig. Generally, your Gauleiter came from the area in which they serve. The native Gauleiter was Gauleiter of his own region. But in some cases, if one had shown a lot of aptitude, a lot of strength of character and oratory, Hitler would assign them to particularly dangerous areas or areas where it would be difficult for the party to obtain traction. So that's why he sent this Bavarian named Albert Forster all the way up to Danzig, because Danzig was a touchy place. It was a free city. Yep. You had much conflict between Germans and Poles, and his goal was to mobilize the population so that they would be ready eventually to unify with Germany. And so that's what he did. And then after the invasion of Poland, he was involved in working to cleanse his district of Jews. He didn't have such a problem with Poles. He would even, if somebody had the slightest bit of what they perceived as German blood, he would be happy to accept them into the fold. Not so with the Jews. Now, Himmler was constantly angry with him because he was not really strict with regard to this Aryan racial nonsense. And that prompted Albert Forster to reputedly say, if I looked like Himmler, I wouldn't talk so much about race. So, but long story short, like the rest of them, he attempted to flee after making a radio broadcast calling on people to fight to the end. And he was captured by the British, extradited to Poland, and sentenced to death by hanging. And we have some pictures of his. Here he is delivering a speech, and here's another occasion where they're mobilizing the Volkssturm, having a hard time with the slides. And then finally, here he is before the Polish National Supreme Court. Yeah.
I think it's because there's a slight lag on the internet, so by the time you see them go up, there's been like a 2-second delay. But yeah, I think that's what the problem is.
Okay, I think I've rambled enough about these guys for one day.
Yeah, I think it will be a good time to bring things to an end. But I think I just want to kind of finish up. There are going to be lots of questions when you come back a second time. But I think to bring things to an end, that we will do it. But I'm going to kind of ask you one kind of concluding question for this session. That is, you just said there about the last guy, and typical, he tries to kind of escape at the end. There's a cowardly aspect to it. In your study of these figures, are there any kind of similar character traits you can identify amongst? Obviously, they all have bought into the ideology. Obviously, loyal to Hitler. But is there anything on a more sort of a human level you can say that kind of unifies them in your study of the background of these people?
Gosh, to be honest with you, there is so much diversity among them all. They maybe within certain age cohorts. I mean, the age span for these people was essentially 1876 is the oldest, Otto Telschow, up to the youngest, which would be Hartmann Lauterbacher, born 1909. Wow. Gosh, as far as I would not say that I could think of a unifying characteristic of a lot of them.
I'm glad you said that.
Despite the similarities,
there are, of course, many things to say, really, because I think, again, like we said at the beginning, we like it when serial killers are psychopaths. We like it when we can put them in a box and say that is the type of person they are. We don't like them when it's more complex, when we can recognize qualities of ordinariness amongst them. I think the fact that they are so very different, and they do come from different regions, and yet they share an ideology, but there's some of them seem to be the kind of people you would not necessarily stand out in a crowd, and yet they've got this. They're part of this mechanism. I think that's what I can understand why you spent the better part of your life studying these guys, because there are questions if I was studying it, I would want to know the answer to that I'm never going to get. What the whys, I think, are the questions that are hard to grasp, but we'll never know, really, will we?
Right, which is why I don't really try to do anything more than just explain the what and the how.
Who they were, what they did, and how they did it. But yeah, well, we will leave things at that. So there's definitely going to be a lot of questions when you come back a second time, but we'll schedule that for some other time, folks. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I think people have been absolutely spellbound by it. Tomorrow we're busting some myths about the MG42. Lots more shows coming up this week. But Michael, I extend the invitation to come back. And again, folks, the links to Michael's work in the description below. Check him out on Twitter. Check him out on the Amazon authors page, and go and get yourself some of these books and read about some of these. We don't like the word monster, but some of these individuals and the monstrous things they were, or the monstrous regime they were part of.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Woody, and everyone.
Brilliant. So, folks, this is Paul Woodadge for WW2TV saying I'll see you all again tomorrow. So cheers, everybody. Thanks for your attention. Bye.